Islamska Declarasija, the Islamic Declaration, written by Alija Izetbegovic. Chapter 1: The Backwardness of the Muslim Peoples. Conservatives and Modernists. The idea of Islamic renewal, which understands Islam as capable not only of educating human beings but also of ordering the world, will always have two types of people as its opponents: conservatives who want the old forms, and modernists who want someone else's forms. The former drag Islam back into the past, the latter push it towards an alien future. Despite differences, both categories of people have something in common. Both see Islam only as a religion in the European sense of the word, a certain lack of feeling for the finesses of language and logic, and even greater failure to grasp the essence of Islam and its role in history and the world, lead them to interpret Islamic belief as mere religion, which for a very special reason is quite erroneous. Although it may seem a reconfirmation of the fundamental truths on the origin of man and his mission, the Islamic approach is quite new in one aspect, that of its demand for the conjunction of faith and knowledge, morals and politics, ideals and interests. By recognizing the existence of two worlds, the natural and the interior, Islam teaches that it is man who bridges the chasm between them. Without this oneness, religion tends towards backwardness, i.e., the rejection of any kind of productive close to knowledge and ever more open to mysticism. Theologians have allowed much that is irrational to be written in this book, things totally foreign to Islamic learning, including sheer superstition. It will be immediately evident to anyone who knows the nature of theology why it has been unable to withstand the temptation of mythology, and why it has seen even in this a certain enrichment of religious thought. The monotheism of the Quran, the purest and most perfect in the history of religious learning, has been gradually compromised, while in practice a distasteful trade in belief has emerged. Those who call themselves interpreters and guardians of the faith have made a career of it, a very agreeable and profitable one, and without many qualms of conscience have come to accept a state of affairs in which its messages have not been implemented at all. Theologians have turned out to be the wrong people in the wrong place. Now, when the Muslim world is giving all signs of an awakening, this class has become the expression of all that is gloomy and sclerotic in the world. It has shown itself to be quite incapable of taking any kind of constructive steps towards making the Islamic world face up to the adversities which press upon it. As far as the so-called progressives, Westerners, modernists, and whatever else they are called are concerned, they are the exemplification of real misfortune throughout the Muslim world, as they are quite numerous and influential, notably in government, education, and public life. Seeing the Hajj and conservatives as the personification of Islam and convincing others to do likewise, the modernists raise a front against all that the idea represents. These self-styled reformers in the present-day Muslim countries might be recognized by their pride in what they should rather be ashamed of, and their shame in what they should be proud of. These are usually daddy's sons, schooled in Europe, from which they return with a deep sense of their own inferiority towards the wealthy West and a personal superiority over the poverty-stricken and backward surroundings from which they spring. Lacking an Islamic upbringing and or any spiritual or moral links with the people, they quickly lose their elementary criteria and imagine that by destroying local ideas, customs, and convictions while introducing alien ones, they will build America, for which they have an exaggerated admiration, overnight on their home soil. Instead of standards, they introduced the cult of a standard. Instead of developing the potential of their own world, they develop desires, thus opening the way to corruption, primitivism, and moral chaos. They cannot see that the power of the Western world does not lie in how it lives, but in how it works, that its strength is not in fashion, godlessness, nightclubs, a younger generation out of control, but in the extraordinary diligence, persistence, knowledge, and responsibility of its people. The main problem, therefore, is not that our Westerners use alien forms, but that they did not know how to use them, or, to put it better, that they did not have a sufficiently developed sense of what was right. They failed to choose the useful product and took over instead the harmful, suffocating byproduct of another civilization. Among the props of doubtful value which our Westerner takes home with him are to be found various "revolutionary" ideas, reform programs, and similar "rescue doctrines" which will "solve all problems." Among these reforms are examples of unbelievable short-sightedness and improvisation. Thus, for example, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who was obviously a greater military leader than a cultural reformer, and whose services to Turkey should be reduced to their proper measure, in one of his reforms prohibited the wearing of the fez. It soon became evident that changing the shape of their caps cannot change what is in people's heads or habits. Many nations outside the Western sphere have been facing the problem of how to relate to this civilization for over a century, whether to opt for outright rejection, cautious adjustment, or total unselective acceptance. The tragedy or triumph of many of them has hung on how they have responded to this fateful question. There are reforms which reflect the wisdom of a particular nation and others which signify betrayal of itself. The examples of Japan and Turkey are classics of modern history in this respect. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both countries provided a picture of very similar comparable countries. Both were ancient empires, each with its own physiognomy and place in history. Both found themselves at approximately the same level of development. Both had a glorious past, which indicated both great privilege and a heavy burden. In a word, their chances for the future were about equal. Then followed the well-known reforms in both countries. In order to continue to live in its own way and not in another, Japan tried to unite tradition and progress, while Turkish modernists chose the opposite path. Today, Turkey is third world country, while Japan had climbed to a pinnacle among the nations of the world. The difference in the philosophy of Japanese and Turkish reformers is nowhere more evident than in the questions of the alphabets. While Turkey abolished Arabic writing, which because of its simplicity and just 28 characters is one of the most perfect and widespread of alphabets, Japan rejected demands by its Romaya to introduce the Roman script. It retains its complicated system which subsequent to the reformers contained 880 Chinese ideograms in addition to 46 characters. No one is illiterate in modern-day Japan, while in Turkey, 40 years after the introduction of the Roman letters, over half of the population cannot read or write, a result which should cause the blind to regain their sight. And that is not all. It soon became evident that what was issue not simply the alphabet as a means of register. The true reasons and thus the consequences were much deeper and more significant. The essence of all human civilization and progress lies in continuation, not in distraction and negation. Its way of writing is the way in which the nation remembers and endures in history. By abolishing the Arabic alphabet, all the wealth of the past preserved in the written world was largely lost to Turkey, and by this single act the country was leveled to the brink of barbarianism. With a series of other parallel reforms, the new Turkish generation found itself with no spiritual prop, in a kind of spiritual vacuum. Turkey had lost the remembrance of its past. Whom did this profit? The supporters of modernism in the Islamic world then were not wise men who sprang from the people, who would know how to implement in a novel way the old ideas and values under changed circumstances. They rose up against the value themselves, and often with icy cynicism and astounding short-sightedness, trampled on what the people held sacred, destroying life and transplanting an imitation in its stead. As a consequence of such barbarity in Turkey and elsewhere, plagiary nations emerge, or are in process of emerging. Countries where spiritual confusion reigns futureless and with no sense of where they are going. Everything in them is derivative and artificial, lacking in force and enthusiasm, like the false glamour of their Europeanized cities. Can a country unsure of its identity, of where its roots lie, have a clear picture of where it is born or what it should be striving for? The example of some of Atatürk's reform may seem drastic. At the same time, they represent a pattern for the Western approach to problems of the Islamic world and the way in which Westerners think to correct it. This invariably means alienation, fleeing from real problems, from painstaking work on the true moral and educational elevation of the people. an orientation towards the external and the superficial. What was meant by the independence of a Muslim country in which the administration of public life fell into the hands of this type of person? How did they make use of that freedom? By accepting foreign modes of thought and by seeking political support from foreigners, whether East or West. Each of these countries voluntarily, through the mouths of their new administrators, acquiesced to re-enslavement. A spiritual and material independence was created, embracing an alien philosophy, an alien way of life, alien aid, alien capital, and alien support. These countries formally achieved independence, but they did not achieve real freedom, since freedom of any kind is primarily spiritual. The independence of a people which has not first won this is reduced soon to an anthem and a flag, two very minor factors for true independence. The struggle for true independence of the Muslim peoples then must begin anew everywhere. The roots of helplessness. These two types, conservatives and modernists, provide the key to understanding the current state of the Muslim peoples. However, they are not the only cause of this state. Taken further, both facets are the manifestation of a deeper cause, the degradation or rejection of Islamic thought. The history of Islam is not only or even mainly the history of a progressive affirmation of Islam in real life. It is just as much a story of incomprehension, neglect, betrayal, and abuse of this idea. Thus, the history of each and every Muslim people is simultaneously a chronology of brilliant achievements and victories, of grievous mistakes and defeat. All our successes and failures, political and moral, are only the reflection of our acceptance of Islam and how we have applied it to life. A weakening in the influence of Islam on the practical life of the people has always been accompanied by their degradation and that of social and political institutions. The entire history of Islam, from its first beginnings to our day, unfolded under the inexorable influence of this coincidence, something of the unalterable fate of the Muslim peoples and one of the laws of Islamic history is to be found in this parallel. Two characteristic moments in Islamic history, one from the age of its ascendancy, one from the age of decadence, very clearly illustrate this effect. Muhammad, peace be upon him, died in 632 AD. Less than 100 years later, the spiritual and political power of Islam extended over a huge area, from the Atlantic Ocean to the river Indus and to China, from Lake Aral to the lower reaches of the Nile. Syria was conquered in 634. Damascus fell in 635. Ctesiphon in 637. India and Egypt was reached in 641. Carthage in 647. Samarkand in 676. Spain in 710. Muslims were at the gates of Constantinople in 717, and in 720 in southern France. There were mosques in Shantung by 700, and about 830 Islam arrived in Java. This unique expansion, to which no other can be compared before or since, provided a space for the development of Islamic civilization in three spheres of culture: Spain, the Middle East, and India, a period of history covering about 1000 years. What do Muslims mean in the contemporary world? The question could be phrased to another way. How far are we Muslims? The answers to these questions are linked. We are enslaved. At one point in 1919, no single independent Muslim country existed. A state of affairs never registered either before or after that date. We are uneducated. In the period between two world wars, no Muslim country had a literacy rate of over 50%. At independence, 75% of the people of Pakistan, 80% of Algerians, and 90% of Nigerians could neither read or write. In contrast, no one in Islamic Spain of the 10th and 11th centuries, according to Draper, was illiterate. We are poor. Gross national income per capita in 1966 in Iran was $220, in Turkey 240, in Malaysia 250, in Pakistan 90, in Afghanistan 85, in Indonesia 70, as against $3,000 in the USA. The shares of industry in the national income of most Muslim countries varies between 10 and 20%. The numbers of calories in the daily diet is an average 2,000 compared to 3,000 until 3,500 in Western Europe. We are a divided community. Instead of a society without either misery or luxury, Muslim society has turned into the opposite. In contradiction to the Quranic command, quote, that this wealth should not only remain within the circle of the rich among you, unquote, from Quran, Surah 39, Ayah 7. Property gradually passed into the hands of a small number. Prior to agrarian reform in Iraq in 1958, out of 22 million dunam of arable lands, about 18 million dunam, or 82%, were held by the great landowners. Meanwhile, 1.4 million peasants had no land at all. One dunam is about one-tenth of a hectare. This was the state of affairs which some have called with reason, quote, the night of Islam, unquote. In fact, that night began with the twilight of our hearts. All that has happened to us or is happening to us today is only the echo and repetition of what has previously happened within ourselves. From Quran, Surah 13, Ayah 12. We as Muslims cannot be subjugated, uneducated, estranged from one another. We cannot be renegades from Islam. All our defeats, from the first at Uhud to the latest on Sinai, confirm this. The phenomenon of the abandonment of Islam, most frequently seen in the suppression of Islamic thought from active and vigilant life, and its reduction to transience and passivity,
can be most clearly observed by taking the Quran, the central fruits of Islamic ideology and practice. It should be remarked that every advance of the Islamic peoples, every age of refinement, began with the affirmation of the Quran. The expansion of early Islam was miraculous course I have already mentioned, and which in the course of 2 generations brought it to the source of the Atlantic Ocean in the west and to the outer reaches of China in the east, is not the only, but is the most glorious example. All major swings in the course of Islamic history confirm this parallel. What was the position of the Quran at the time preceding the age of stagnation and retreat? Devotion to the book did not change, but it lost its active character while retaining what was irrational in mystic. The Quran lost its authority as law while gaining in sanctity as an object. In study and interpretation, wisdom yielded to hair splitting, essence yielded to form, and grandeur of thought to the skill of recitation. Under the constant influence of theological formalism, the Quran was read less and recited more, while commandments on struggle, uprightness, personal and material sacrifice, harsh and repellent to our inertia, dissolve and vanish in the pleasant sound of the Quranic text learned of by her. This unnatural state of affairs came to be accepted as the norm, because it suited an even more numerous group of Muslims who could neither break with the Quran nor summon the strength to order their lives according to its dictates. The psychological explanation of the exaggerated importance given to recital of the Quran may be found in this fact. The Quran is recited, interpreted and recited, then studied and recited again. One sentence is repeated thousands of times in order not to have to apply it once. An extensive and pedantic science has been established on how the Quran should be pronounced so as to avoid the issue of how to practice it in daily life. Ultimately, the Quran has been turned into naked sound without visible sense or meaning. All the reality of the Muslim world, with its discrepancy between word and deed, its debauchery, dirt, injustice, and cowardice, its monumental empty mosques, its great white turbans, devoid of ideals or courage, its hypocritical Islamic catchphrases and religious posing. This faith without belief is but the external reflection of the fundamental contradiction in which the Quran found itself, in which burning allegiance to the book was gradually combined with total neglect of its principles in practice. The situation of the Quran is the first and most important cause of backwardness and helplessness among the Muslim peoples. Another cause of universal importance is education, or rather the system of upbringing in the broadest sense. For centuries now, our peoples have been deprived of educated people. Instead, they have two other types. equally undesirable: the uneducated and the wrongly educated. In no Muslim country do we have a system of education sufficiently developed and thus capable of responding to the moral understanding of Islam and the needs of the people. Our rulers either neglected this most sensitive institution of any society or left it up to strangers. The schools to which foreigners donated money and personnel, and thereby curricula and ideology, did not educate Muslims, not even nationalists. In them, our budding intellectuals were injected with the virtues of obedience, submission, and admiration for the might and wealth of the foreigner. In them, foreign tutors fostered a vassal mentality in the intelligentsia, which would in the future replace them with extraordinary success, because the latter would feel themselves to be foreigners in their own country and behave accordingly. It would be most informative to discover the number of schools and colleges which are held directly or indirectly by foreigners, and to reflect on the reasons for this extraordinary generosity. The curricula of these institutions should be gone into in depth and examined for content, perhaps even more so for what they fail to contain. It would soon be clear that the real question is not whether our intelligentsia wish to find a path to its people, to their real inclinations and interests, but whether, constituted as it can find that path at all. What is at stake are the values and ideals which have been imposed on it, and the psychological gap which has been created. Iron chains are no longer necessary to keep our peoples in submission. The silken cords of this alien education have the same power, paralyzing the minds and will of the educated. While education is so conceived, foreign wielders of power and their vassals in Muslim countries need have no fear for their position. Instead of being a source of rebellion and resistance, this system of education is their best ally. This system of education is once again their best ally. The tragic gap between the intelligentsia and the people, which is one of the darkest features of our overall position, is re-entrenched from the other side. Sensing the alien and non-Islamic character of the schools on offer, the people instinctively reject them, so that the estrangement becomes mutual. Absurd accusations are constructed as to the disinclination of Muslim environments towards school and education. In fact, it is clear that this is not a question of rejecting schools as such, but of rejecting alien schools, which have lost every spiritual link with Islam and the people. Indifference of the Muslim masses. The about turn effected by modernists in a series of Muslim countries was, almost as a rule, anti-religious and led by slogans on the declericalization of political and social life. From this aspect, it is reminiscent of the struggle between the awakening national states and the Church in Europe on the threshold of the modern age. But what mean progress and constitutionality for the West represented an unnatural process in the Islamic world, one which was incapable of effecting constructive change. Declericalization and nationalism had no positive aspects here and were in fact merely a negation. Foreign in origin and method, they were the reflection of a pervasive spiritual sterility. With them, the curtain rose on the last act in the drama of the Muslim world. Every renaissance occurs as the result of creative contact, affinity, or internal concord between the thinking and leading elements in a society on the one hand, and the populace at large on the other. The leading group represents will and thought, the people, the heart and blood of any great undertaking. Without the cooperation, or at least consent of the ordinary man, all action remains superficial, lacking in strike force. The sluggishness of the masses can be overcome if it is merely the consequence of a natural resistance to hard work, danger, and struggle. It is impossible to overcome if it represents a rejection of the very ideals of the struggle, because it perceives that ideal as opposed to the most intimate wishes and feelings of the masses. It is the latter case which may be observed to a greater or lesser extent in all Muslim countries where modernists attempt to implement their programs. They flatter and threaten, plead and goad, organize and reorganize, change names and personalities, but run up against the stubborn rejection and indifference of ordinary people, who make up the majority of the nation. Habib Bourguiba, mentioned here simply as being representative of a widespread tendency, wears European clothes, speaks French at home, isolates Tunisia not only from the Islamic but also from the Arab world, restricts religious training, calls for the abolition of the Ramadan fast as fasting reduces productivity, while he himself drinks orange juice in public in order to set a suitable example. After all this, he wonders at the passivity and lack of support from the part of the Tunisian masses for his learned reforms. Modernists would not be what they are if they did not demonstrate this type of blindness. The Muslim peoples will never accept anything which is expressly opposed to Islam, because Islam is not just a collection of ideas and laws, but has transcended into love and feeling. He who rises up against Islam will reap nothing but hatred and resistance. By their acts, modernists have created a state of internal conflict and confusion in which any program, Islamic or foreign, becomes impracticable. The masses want Islamic action, but cannot carry it through without the intelligentsia. An alienated intelligentsia imposes a program but cannot find enough people prepared to contribute blood, sweat, and enthusiasm for this paper ideal. The opposing forces cancel each other out, and a stage of powerlessness and paralysis sets in. There is an order, a dynamic, a prosperity, a progress which could be brought about on this ground and in these parts of the world. But this is not the order progress or prosperity of Europe or America. The indifference of the Muslim masses is not indifference at all. It is the way in which folk Islam defends itself against outside, alien assault. Wherever there was the least prospect of an Islamic struggle, the ordinary man proved his readiness to fight, suffer, and die. This was the example given by Turkey in the liberation struggle against Greece. Following defeat in World War I, the heroic resistance in Libya against Italian occupation, and the recent examples of struggle against the British in Suez, the war for the liberation of Algeria, for the retention of Indonesia, and for Islamic influence in Pakistan. Wherever the masses had to be aroused, Islamic slogans were used, however temporarily and insincerely. Where there is Islam, there is no indifference. The manifest feelings of the Muslim masses need an idea which would move and direct them, but this cannot be just any idea. It must be one which corresponds to their deepest feeling. It can only, therefore, be an Islamic idea. There is no chance that the Muslim masses and their present intellectual and political leadership could agree on someone among them renouncing his ideal, regardless of how long this state of expectation and indecision may last. There is only one possible way out: the formation and grouping of a new intelligentsia which thinks and feels Islam. This intelligentsia would then fly the flag of the Islamic order and, together with the Muslim masses, take action to bring it about.